Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to a museum audience. This is kind of fun. I know it'll be a little disappointment. I have no giant snakes in this talk, nor any killer bees, so you'll just have to we'll go with what we've got. So what I want to do tonight is talk about pollination and how important pollination is, and both what's happening with honeybees, which is something most people have heard about in one way or another, and then probably less well-known to people is I want to talk about wild bees and what they may be doing for us, who they are, and how valuable they might be. So really the place to start is with, whoops, boy, that went fast, is with the pollinators. One of the things I always put on one of these slides is the amount of money that we're talking about here. This is economically important. Pollination is incredibly important from a money point of view. Estimation, it's about $225 billion worldwide in terms of the free services that pollinators are doing for us, and what we get for that pollination service, for the movement of pollen from stamens, the male parts of flowers, to the female parts of flowers, is lots of really good stuff. Okay, you see some of it up here. Berries, melons, all of those kinds of wonderful fruits we get in the summertime. Vegetables, squash. Squash even has its own genus of bees that pollinate nothing but squashes. Why is all that food important? Well, that food's important to us because, in fact, it provides an enormous number of vitamins and minerals and complex carbohydrates and all of those kinds of things that we need. Not much in the way of protein, but all of those other things we need. And really, our health depends on that diversity of foods that we're eating. I throw in two other products that are pollinated by animals that are important. One, to me personally, it's these coffee beans here. They need pollination. They need pollinators to get that product. And the other one I'll tell you about a lot more tonight is become a favorite of mine, and that's almonds. That's a really big business when it comes to bees. So we're getting all of these great services for these from these organisms, bees mostly, and the question really is, sort of, who is doing this work for us? And the ones that are doing the work for us, the ones that you know about, the ones everybody's familiar with, are honeybees. Here's a typical, what you might see out in your garden kind of honeybee. Honeybees are well known. People have been celebrating honeybees in history for decades, centuries, old paintings. This is a top of a building in Prague that I ran across about a month ago and went, oh, look, so we have a nice little bee colony here. Well, the thing about honeybees that makes them so unusual when we get to bees is that we don't really get colonies like that anymore. We don't use those. We use colonies like this. Honeybee is the only species of bee that lives in these huge colonies. And so there can be 10 to 30,000 individuals in a colony of honeybees. And so that nature that they have of being so very highly social is what makes them so valuable, because you can keep them in these kinds of boxes, as a matter of fact. A couple of things about the biology of honeybees which are interesting to me. They have this characteristic two cells here on the front wing. If you see any bee that has that, it's a honeybee. And so it sort of looks like a thumb and a finger that's sort of like that. The other thing about honeybees, which is unusual and different, unique to the bees, is that they have hairy eyes. So here's the honeybee eye with all of these little hairs that are coming out of it. Turns out those are important. They're a sensory organism. The bees are using them to sense wind speed and direction. So honeybees are using those when they're out there foraging. Okay, so we get the honeybees that are doing this. This is good. We have lots of them, colonies everywhere. But the problem is that we've we've got some issues with the honeybees. And what's happened in the U.S. over the last 60 so years, since around 1950, we've lost half of the honeybee colonies in the United States. People just stopped keeping bees. So we went from over 5 million colonies down to around 2.5 million colonies now. Similar kinds of decreases in honeybees colonies in Europe, so they've seen quite a decrease in the numbers of colonies that are being kept. But the odd part about it, if you look at the total number of honeybee colonies in the world, it really hasn't gone down that much. So globally, honeybee colony numbers are about the same. Of course, the question you might want to ask is, where the heck are all those honeybee colonies? Most of them are in Asia now. Okay, so while we've had an increase in honeybee colonies worldwide, the problem is that you can't take honeybee colonies and ship them to California to pollinate almonds. You can't take them from Asia to do that. You have to have them on your own continent. So that means that there are some shortages. The other problem with saying, well, we shouldn't worry about the honeybees, we've got about as many colonies as we did 50 years ago, it's the demand has skyrocketed for pollination by honeybees. So there's many more farms, there's many more places that are growing crops. People are much more aware about the value of diversity of items in their diet. So people are growing that. We have all these local farmers markets. Demand is way, way up. All right, well, okay, so what's the problem? The problem is the thing that you guys all probably know about, and that's this colony collapse disorder. This gets to be complicated. It's not a simple story to try and explain what colony collapse actually is. Mostly it manifests itself as bees just disappearing. They just are there at one point. The beekeeper comes back at another point in time to check on his hive. He has perfectly good queens. Everything looked right, is fine, and the bees are just gone. Occasionally, they don't just disappear, but they die nearby, and you can get these kinds of photographs with hundreds and hundreds, thousands of dead bees very near a colony. Most of the time, they just go away. You don't even have the corpses to try and figure out what's going on most of the time. There was a whole thing about cell phones causing the bees to disappear. That's not so. Finish with that idea, okay? Not so. What we do know that is involved now are these things that are called RNA viruses that are using the ribonucleic acid as their genetic material. They're not the sole cause. These are viruses just like all the kinds of viruses that we probably carry around with us, lots of other ones. Here are some viruses, RNA viruses that I know you all know. SARS, influenza, yellow fever, rubella, polio, hepatitis C are all RNA viruses. So there's lots of these things out there. We've identified a whole bunch of these RNA viruses in honeybees that we think contribute to colony collapse. The problem is that it's most likely a situation where when you have anything else that weakens the colony in some way, and there are a lot of other things like some of these varroa mites and pesticides and things like that, the viruses can take off and maybe kill the colony. So you have a weakened colony. It's sort of like what happens when someone breaks their hip, they go into the hospital. It's not the hip that kills them, it's the influenza that they get, it's the pneumonia that they pick up in the hospital, and that kills them. This is kind of what we think is going on. There are all this convergence of sort of bad things are happening to these colonies. They're weakened because of these varroa mites. We know pesticides are an issue with the honeybees because the genome has been sequenced and they don't seem to be doing very well for immune genes in that particular genome. So colony collapse has kind of gotten to be the name, but it's more complex, and there's a number of different pieces to this. There's also a fair number of these RNA viruses. They have some great names. I really like the names. There's the Kashmir bee virus. The first one that was identified was the Israeli acute paralysis virus. Okay. Another one I like is Black Queen virus. There's another paralysis virus. and a whole list of these things, okay, that we know are out there, and at least in some of these bee communities. So honeybees got all of these problems with them, and what we really need to kind of think about is what might help us with pollination besides honeybees. Well, it turns out we have a huge bee community out there, native bee community. Globally, 20,000 species. Nobody's sure. Bees are hard to identify. We probably have 4,000 or so in the U.S. I'll show you some numbers on what we have in Iowa in just a little bit. Now, these solitary bees are really very different from the honeybee, which lives in these colonies of thousands of individuals. For these solitary bees, excluding a few of the bumblebees that might have a dozen workers or so, in these species, each female is going out, collecting nectar, collecting pollen on her own by herself. She goes back to her nest. She goes into her nest hole, usually in the ground. She will construct a little reproductive cell. She will pack in that pollen, that food source. She'll lay an egg on it. She'll seal it off, and she'll go back out, and she'll do that for as long as she lives. In these cases, these bees, these individuals, they're maybe 2 or 3 weeks is their lifespan for a given individual. Their fitness is how many of those reproductive cells they do. So each female is on her own with these solitary bees. So as all of these problems started developing with colony collapse and with threats to our supply of these pollinators, people started saying, well, what about the solitary bees out there? Can they help us? Are they valuable to us? Do they do any pollination, any significant kind of pollination? And so that's one of the things that I've been working on with a lot of other people, is trying to determine what kind of contribution these solitary bees, these wild bees, might be making. One of the things that we've got very interested in, as soon as people started finding the viruses in honeybees, we immediately said, are there these viruses in wild bees? Have these viruses already, most of which have been introduced, by the way, they're viruses that have come in very recently, have they already spread, or are they spreading to the wild bees? And so Kate's sitting back there, she's in the left, and that's me and Kate doing our version of sterile sampling in the field, which we did pretty good at, actually. So we have collected a number of bee species to look for these viruses. We haven't done it yet, but we're all ready to go finally. We don't have any kind of profile of what kind of viruses there might be in wild bees. I think, personally, what we're going to find is a lot of viruses, and that these bees are carrying these viruses, but they're not showing any symptoms, that they're asymptomatic, like we carry viruses and are asymptomatic of viral infections most of the time. We did have a study come out about a year ago that turned out to be, I think it will be, a very important study. It was one where they were trying to determine if it was possible for the bees to be moving the viruses around. And indeed, the paper suggests, with the data they had, that in fact it's at the flowers that these RNA viruses are getting transferred. So honeybees going to a plant, and then wild bees going to that plant or that flower afterwards, they could pick up these viruses. So there's good reason to think they're going to be there. We don't know quite yet whether that's so or not. Okay, let's talk about almonds. Okay, almonds are an amazing kind of crop. For one thing, the size of this endeavor to grow almonds in California is kind of amazing. We're talking about now 825,000 acres of almonds in California. You can see it's about a 70% increase over a little more than a decade ago. So in the Central Valley of California, they are taking out all kinds of stuff and they put in almonds. Okay? There are some things about almonds that make this a difficult crop to grow. Well, we're getting a lot of almonds out of this in California in terms of, over 1 2/3 billion pounds of almonds. About the worst you can do on selling almonds wholesale is you can go through people like Blue Diamond and those kinds of places, and the growers are getting about $3 a pop per pound for almonds. So you can imagine what the value of this crop is to our economy and to California's economy. They get more money from almonds in California than they do from wine and all of the wine products that they sell in California. That's how important it is. But it's a hard crop to grow. The most critical thing about almonds is that you have to have cross-pollination to get an almond. That is, you have to have pollen from one variety of tree fertilize the flowers on a different variety of tree. You have to have cross-pollination to get an almond. And so one of the things that they do in almond growing country is that they plant different varieties in different rows. Okay, the rows happen to be going this way, but it'll be one variety in this row, a different variety, compatible variety as a pollen donor in the next row. And they have various planting schemes that they've done with that. So that's where our bees are going to come in, but the whole endeavor is just incredible to me. These trees have mostly peach rootstock, which has a better rootstock. So every one of these trees is actually a graft and starts as a graft onto peach rootstock. You have to irrigate these things all the time. They cannot stand that dry summer in California in the Central Valley, so there's all kinds of water issues with it. You don't just set up big sprinklers in these almond groves. They're all done with emitters, and so you can kind of see this little black line here. That's actually a hose for emitters, and each tree gets 4 emitters. Problem with emitters and doing this, saves a lot of water. Let me tell you, you got to filter that water. It comes out of an irrigation ditch. And so there's a lot of filtering goes on, because the last thing you want to do is to go into an almond grove and try to figure out which of the emitters are clogged. 4 per tree. You could be there a while. Then you have the problem with almond groves too, is it takes about 5 years to get to a place where you even start to get a crop out of this. So these little groves that are included in this 825,000 acres are ones that they're not going to be productive for a while. It's a huge investment just to get a crop going. Okay, here's the bee pollination problem with almonds in California. It takes 1.25 million colonies of honeybees to pollinate the almond crop in California. It's half of the colonies in the United States are now shipped to California in these kinds of conditions from everywhere. They come from Texas, they come from Florida, some come from north down in Oregon, they come back down into California. When colony collapse hit, this was panic city for the almond growers in California, and the price of renting a colony of bees went from about $75 to $200 a colony to rent it for 3 weeks. During the period, actually right now, it's almond pollination season in California. Start doing the math. You need two hives, 2 colonies per acre of trees. You've got 100 acres of trees. You need 200 colonies. You're paying $200 a colony. And you begin to understand why for the almond growers, the most expensive part of this whole process is the pollination. Okay? It's huge. It's a huge cost. Colonies got so expensive, people started stealing them. The beekeepers, the bee yard people they call them, were so suspicious of anybody coming around their colony. So I was out there doing work in the groves, and there was a guy who had his colonies all stacked up ready to distribute in the grove, and I was kind of walking around taking pictures. I don't know how he knew I was there, but I think within 5 minutes, he maybe saw my car. He was there. Hi, how you doing? You know, sort of, what are you doing here? And so I explained myself, we're okay. But theft got to be a big problem. And then the other problem is that we're going to see is most of these groves, many of them are like monocultures. It's like corn. It's like Iowa, except it's almond trees. It's just nothing but almond trees. All kinds of problems with these bees. You got to do supplemental feeding. This is a kind of a pellety food protein material that comes in bags, and they just dump it on the ground and the bees collect it. So a lot of problems with the bees there. So the almond growers are very interested in alternatives to honeybees and how that might help them at least buffer some of these pollination issues with honeybees. They're doing some interesting things with the honeybees. The grower that we work with has been doing this for about 5 years. It's spread up the valley, and there's a lot more growers doing this. Remember, it's a In almonds, it's a cross-pollination, so you got to have the right pollen being deposited from a different variety. What you can do, and what my friend Drew, our grower, does, is that bees are coming in out of here. He gets up real early in the morning, he goes out into his grove, and he goes, oh, look, the honeybees are going to nonpareil today. They like nonpareil. And they tend to like to stick to the same tree variety. They go down rows. Honeybees tend to go down rows more than between rows, which of course is a problem. What Drew figured out to do was he collected pollen, kept it in his freezer. He goes out in the morning and he spreads pollen along the entrance hole where the bees are coming out. So as soon as he knows where they're going to go, he puts on the appropriate pollen. The bees come out. They're picking up pollen as they leave. And Drew really doesn't have bad years. I mean, it's this kind of thing that really does help. Now there's a lot of people doing this very same thing with helping these honeybees along by giving them the right kind of pollen to carry. The other idea that people have come up with is, well, let's try some other kind of bee. This is the blue orchard bee. It is a bee that normally will nest in these cavities like you see here. These are great little setups. So you can get quite a few bees with multiple bees in a hole in these blocks of wood. There's some issues with the blue orchard bee. One is that it's a little slower in development, okay, than you want for almond pollination. So what you have to do is you've got to kind of give them a little bit of warmth. So every one of these little boxes has a car battery in it that runs a little heater that keeps it all nice and toasty. And then the blue orchard bees come out at the right time to do the pollination. What they also do is that, because sometimes you get a lot of bees coming out when you do this, they put up little sort of blue orchard bee condominiums, vacation homes, like these little things down further in the rows. And people are, we haven't seen much in the way of results of how effective this is, but definitely there's a lot more interest in the blue orchard bee now as an alternative to honeybees, or in addition to, I should say. So what are the wild bees doing? We were interested in what these wild bees might be contributing to almond pollination. We already knew there's a whole suite of these wild bees that are in some of these orchards that are near natural areas. Here's a bumblebee, Serratinus, Andrina up there. And so we wanted to know how effective the honeybees and the wild bees are in delivering pollen. So I will say I did not think of this, okay? A co-worker, Claire Crimmen, thought of this way of figuring this out with what she beautifully calls her wand experiment. So here's a wand. A wand is that you take an almond branch, you cover it with a bag before any of the flowers open, you wait for them to open. Nobody's seen these flowers, no insects have seen these flowers. You can then just snip that branch off when the flowers open, and you carry it around. You go to a tree that's of the right variety for those female flowers, and you wait for somebody to come. So you just wait for a bee to come to a flower, and you may have 20 flowers on a branch, so it's not, it happens. You wait, you time it, you get who it is, you look at who it is. You collect the flower, you strip off all the parts, you put it in a little Eppendorf tube with a little bit of water, and you wait 3 days, and then you find an undergraduate to count pollen tubes. Okay? So we did this for a whole lot of orchards, and when you do that, it is kind of neat, because this is the kind of thing you get out of this at the end. This is a style with all of the pollen tubes running down it. That's what each of these are that you see here. And what we found with this was that, in fact, the solitary bees are significantly better deliverers of pollen than are honeybees. It is statistically significantly more pollen delivered in terms of tubes. And for an almond, you need somewhere between 30 and 40 pollen tubes to actually get the almond to develop, the ovary to develop. So the honeybees are not all that great at pollinating almonds, okay? Not only do they tend to stick to the same row, not completely, but they tend to come and go from the flowers really fast. The reason we think they're not as good a pollinator is because the wild bees stay in the flower longer than the honeybees. The honeybees are in. The average time for the honeybees was like 3 seconds. The wild bees, while there's some that are small, there was many that were much, much longer, sometimes as much as a minute in a given flower. So that was good news. The wild bees are doing a good job, better than the honeybees. The question that we really wanted to ask, though, was sort of on a grove basis, on an orchard basis, does this matter? And so if you look at it over orchards, I just want to throw a graphic in here. Here what it's really showing is that the percentage of flowers setting fruit, producing an almond, if you're in a grove without any wild bees, it's about 35 or so percent. Here's what you get if you're in a grove where you have access to wild bees, where there's enough native habitat around to get wild bees. You're up around 55%. And while not all of those flowers are likely to set fruit, the difference between a good crop for an almond grower and a really good crop is the difference between about 35 and 38% fruit set. Okay? It's not a big difference to have this be important. So that was good news. These wild bees are making a significant contribution to the almonds. We found something else, though, that we didn't know quite what to do with for the longest time. Let me explain what we're doing. What we're looking at here is how many pollen tubes are getting to the ovary in groves where there are no wild bees and groves where there are wild bees, but we're looking only at honeybees. So we're asking how effective are honeybees, or is there a difference in the effectiveness of honeybees when wild bees are there or not? And by golly, there is. Okay? In other words, when the wild bees are present, the honeybees are better pollinators. Okay? And we went, oh, isn't that interesting? What the heck is going on here? We have some ideas of why we think that is happening. What we really think is happening is that when wild bees are present, it is disturbing the normal behaviors of the honeybees, and they are ending up flying between rows more often than they do when they are just honeybees by themselves. Okay? So we think somehow the wild bees disrupt the movement behavior, and the honeybees are more likely to go to a different variety, cross a row rather than going down a row. We've done some mathematical modeling of this, and we can get our model to get the honeybees to go way to the edges of trees where they're supposed to, where we think they would have more likely to go to a different tree. So that's one of the things we did. We weren't satisfied just with trying to model this. Last year we did this experiment. Okay? We set up huge cages in an almond grove. We set up 3 of these cages. You can see how big they are. They're about 30 feet by 50 feet. I was smart enough not to get to California until the cages were already set up. Okay. We have one cage where we just have honeybees. We have one cage where we just have the blue orchard bees. And then we have another one where we have both. We were in there looking at the flight of bees between and within rows because we have 8 trees covered in here. And so there were some problems with this experiment. The weather didn't help us, so I haven't actually seen the data. But hopefully this will tell us a little something about, with some empirical data, about movements and changes in movements when something like a blue orchard bee is present as well. Okay, that's almonds. I want to talk about the stuff we've been doing in Iowa, because we've been looking at wild bees in Iowa for a long time. I got interested in this way back in 2000. This shows you what we were finding in terms of species of bees in Iowa. And I really need to redo this graphic. What you can see is that after about 400 hours of swinging a net out in prairies, we got up to about 150 species of bees in Iowa. We've got at least 50 to 60 more species that we know of. And so my guess is there's probably 300 species of bees in Iowa at least. Okay, so that's kind of what our diversity is. These are all the solitary bees. One of the problems is that we'd like to know where, for example, biologically, just the ecology of where they nest. And most of them nest in the ground, and I thought I would put these magenta arrows on here because it would make it really easy to see the hole in the ground where the bees are nesting. Didn't work out so well. It's actually right there and right there. So finding bee nests in the ground is not so easy. Other bees, and I want to point that out, nest in stems of plants. There's one family in particular nests in these stems, and where each one of these cells has pollen in it. It's little leaf fragments. That'll come up in a second. So we got really interested in basic questions. What's the diversity of bees on Iowa's prairies? Okay. What controls the diversity, or what influences that diversity on the prairies? So back in 2002 or so, we started with 7 prairies. We sampled over a number of years. We were doing sweep samples, and we used these little things. They're called pan traps. They're just a little plastic solo bowl. We used 3 colors because different bees like different colors: white, blue, yellow. And so we pan trap for bees. You put a little soapy water in here. The bee lands on it. They can't get out. And then we harvest them, shall we say. All right. So that's the kind of stuff that we were doing. We had a couple years of data on plants at the site, because we're interested in whether better sites with more plants have a greater diversity of bees. But we also wanted to know about the landscapes. And the reason the landscape becomes important around these prairies is that these bees could fly long distances. They are clearly able to fly much greater distances than are encompassed by the boundaries of a prairie preserve, okay? Even a 240-acre prairie preserve. They can fly a couple of kilometers. Is probably not so far wrong for many of these bees. So we want to know what's the relative role of the local site characteristics, and what's the relative role of the landscape around the site in influencing bee diversity. So we had to do the landscape. We wanted to know about the landscape. What's important about the landscape? Flowers are important about the landscape. We took a landscape. Here's Anderson Prairie. We do a lot of polygon drawing with GIS. We had 9 categories of landscapes. We would go out and actually look at each of the polygons that we would draw on this map. Each one has a little number. We would give it a rating based on the diversity and the quantity of floral resources in the polygon. And then we were doing this because we're interested in, well, how far out from the center of a prairie do you have to go to find out what, to get a prediction of what the diversity will be at that prairie? So we did 500 meters, here's 1.5, here's 2 kilometers on this particular graphic. So we have different radii that we were looking at. All right, well, what do we get when we do this? What we find is that the richness of the bee community at a prairie increases when you have a better landscape around the prairie. Surprisingly, all these prairies are pretty rich plant-wise, and we didn't have much of effect that we could find of the actual plants at the prairie influencing this. It's what's around it. So the better the floral resources around it, the more the bee richness and the bee diversity, the greater amount of row crop agriculture you have around a prairie preserve, the lower will be your diversity of bees at that preserve. Here's 2 examples. Here's our best one, Kaler Prairie. Look at all this nice land over here. There's fairly good resources in here around our little square prairie. This is the opposite extreme. This is Calso Prairie up there, Pocahontas. All that purple that you see and the white, that's row crop fields. It's corn and soybeans. It's like 90% of what's around Calso. And it has the poorest bee community that we've got of our 7 preserves. The local stuff does play a role, but it didn't seem to be as important as the landscape. So the next question we wanted to get to was, does size matter? Does the size of the preserve have an effect on the bee community that will be there, or the size of the prairie patch? So we specifically went out, we found a number of these little small linear railroad remnants that are basically unmanaged, but we picked ones that had a great deal of plant richness. So they're all pretty good little remnants, in case not all that scrappy. We did some pan trapping there. We compared them to the prairies, sampled our plants, of course, at the same time. And of course, we went into this, I will admit, I went into this thinking, these little tiny prairie patches, forget it. They're going to have poor bee diversity. I could almost start writing the paper, I thought, okay? I know the answer to this question. Well, wrong. I did not know the answer to that question. We were astounded. These little prairie remnants, they might not be any bigger than this room, some of them. Some of them are just square meters. They had as good a bee diversity, as good as bee richness. The bee abundance was the same as a huge preserve. And they also had, in a given plant species, richness per unit area, just like the prairies as well. So that, we think, is the key. So we could not tell any difference between a small remnant prairie and a big preserve, given that it's a good little remnant. The one place where we found a difference was in these cavity nesting bees that I told you about. There was more of them at these little remnants than there was at the large prairies. We think that was a management issue. We think that the little remnants along these railroads, they don't get managed. They don't do anything to them at all. So there's actually a fair diversity of stems of weedy plants for these bees to utilize. And so we think that's why we get more cavity nesters at some of these little railroad remnants, is because in fact they're actually not managed. That's the only reason we can come up with on that. All right, so here's another question. Little high quality remnants are good. They can support a very diverse bee community. But what about these kinds of places? What about these strips of sort of area that they put in to protect streams? And they're not putting them in there for flowers. There's not much there. They're rather poor quality from a bee point of view, but there's a lot of them, so we see these kinds of strips. We wanted to know what kind of bee community is supported by these. And so we compared some of these sites with nearby prairies. This was an interesting experiment because the way we set our study, we set this up so that we had a prairie preserve, no more than a mile apart, and then one of these rural areas in between. Theoretically, the bees from these prairies could reach this site. It's not beyond their flying ability to do that. So they could potentially get there, and we had 3 sets of these that we looked at. Well, here things turned out to be a little more like what we expected. The prairies are better than these rather scrappy strips of vegetation that are used for weed control, used for erosion control. They don't have much in them. It's mostly grass. These prairies have better diversity and richness and abundance. They have better plants. But we thought maybe it's the composition of these communities. Maybe even though there's not much there in the way of bees, these rural areas, these weedy strips could hold rare species of bees. Turned out that wasn't so either. We only get common species at these places. So the rural strips, they're probably helping with erosion. They're not helping the bees much at all. Not unless you improve the plants that are in them. Okay. At this point, I was doing all this work in California on almonds, and we're talking a lot about agriculture, and I got to be very interested in whether or not, in fact, the wild bees are doing services here in Iowa for our crops that we grow, our produce crops, as well as what we're seeing in California. And so we wanted to ask these kinds of questions about pollination on these farms. These are the ones that are producing all these wonderful things that we get in our farmers market down there every Saturday, okay? And so they're coming from local places. We wanted to know, are the wild bees really doing anything at these farms? And are we going to see the same sort of things we see with the prairies? That is, will the landscape around the farm have an impact on the diversity and maybe abundance of bees that we find at a farm? And then lastly, we're also interested in whether or not, in fact, these crops are pollinator limited. I mean, is that what's determining the amount of produce that these farmers can produce? I'll tell you right now, we don't have an answer to this yet. Okay, we're still working on kind of how to do this. So we've concentrated on the first 2 questions so far. And we did this in 2010. This was Kate Digman's honors thesis. We did 6 farms. We got about 1,200 or so bees out of this study. About 10% of them were, in fact, honeybees, Apis mellifera, and about 14% bumblebees. But what it turns out is that, in fact, nearly all of the pollination on these farms is done by the wild bees. Okay? Even at farms Well, we got 14% of our bees were honeybees that we collected off of the flowers or out of pan traps, even at farms where they had honeybees colonies. We didn't see much in terms of the plot that we were sampling in. So, in fact, it looks like the wild bees are doing almost all the pollination at these farms. Honeybees are probably not contributing all that much. Turns out when I talked to some people working on the East Coast, they are getting almost exactly the same results with produce farms in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and places like that. Here's a landscape effect. I won't show too many graphics. This is basically the proportion of the landscape that has nothing for bees. So we're talking about impervious surfaces, house roofs, all that kind of thing. As you get more of that stuff, you're getting a decrease in the diversity of bees at the farm. Landscapes, again, are important. This is our diversity index that we use. You don't need to know anything more about it, except for the fact that one of the things that we would really like to be able to do when we started this was that what I really want to know is this bee diversity at these farms equivalent to the diversity that we see at a prairie? Okay? So that's what we really would like, that's the comparison we would like to make. We have a problem in trying to do that. And the problem is that to make those kinds of comparisons with diversity measures, particularly about bees, but really almost any organism, the problem is that the more you go out there and collect, the more you're going to find. Okay, the more species you're going to find. So you can only make comparisons statistically if you have exactly the same sampling effort, okay, amount and kind of sampling. Okay, nobody has had this. But we realized that we had all this bee data from Northwest Iowa and that we could do what's called a Monte Carlo sampling. The unequal sampling means we can't just take our diversity of a farm and compare it to the diversities of prairies, because we sample 2 or 3 times as much at the prairies. I know the prairies are going to have better diversity, but the question is, if the sampling was equal, what would it look like? So what you can do is you can use this Monte Carlo simulation. You can go into our whole big data set for the prairies, and we can draw out samples so that we have exactly the same sampling effort as we used at the farms. Okay, we'll have a sweep sample, we'll have a pan trap sample, we'll have one for June, July, and August of each of those. And you draw it out and you get a sample and you calculate a diversity index. And then you do it again, and then you do it again. And then when you get to 1,000 of them, you've got a random distribution. You've got a distribution of what diversity indices might look like. Okay, and now you can compare that distribution to your individual samples. Here's what you see. Here's our distribution from the Monte Carlo. Most of the time, if you had equal sampling on a prairie, you're going to get diversity somewhere up here in the 3.5 to 4 range on the measure we use. This is where the farms are residing on this distribution, at the low end. Now, this may not be the final word on this. We had one genus of bees that are really hard to identify. We've got those off being identified. It's going to change these numbers and move things a little, but I'm not sure how much it's going to move it. So it looks to us like the farms may be a little low on diversity. Turns out we were able to create the same distribution for abundances instead of diversities. And when you look at abundances, the abundances at the farms are fine. The numbers of bees are okay, but we're not convinced that diversity may be lower at the farms, even if abundance is okay. Here's the big question for us. The big question is, are we losing wild bee diversity now? Okay, that's the question we want to answer. The problem we have is that we don't have any befores to compare samples with today. All right, we have some signs that suggest there might be some declines going on. So here's the kind of evidence we have. We have some astoundingly good inventory work from a few places, for example, in the United States. All right, and people have gone back and tried to resample those, but that inventory work is not nearly as intense as the original sampling. And there are some common species that were found then that are not found now. So there's that kind of evidence. There's some evidence where people have gone out in England, for example, also in the Netherlands, where they've focused on, for example, bumblebees, and they have pretty good information on the bumblebee community. So what they've done is to go back and resample, and what they have, or what I refer to, is failure to find data. They've gone out, they've looked, there's some species they can't find anymore. So the problem is, I mean, I trust these people, I know these people, they're good bee biologists, they're good at swinging a net. If they were there, they probably would have got them. But you always face that question of, well, why don't you just go out a little more and look a little more, and maybe you'll find them. There's failure to find on bumblebees in the United States. Sidney Cameron at University of Illinois has just put out a study that suggests exactly the same thing. There's been some shrinkages of ranges, and there's a few species that we're having trouble finding now, failure to find. So the problem that we have is that we can't make any statistical comparisons between a then and a now, because the sampling is different. There's more of it, it's different kinds. So what I realized is that, having been in this business for a decade, it finally dawned on me about a year ago or so that, in fact, I can get this data. Okay? I have data from 10 years ago on these prairies that I sampled, and I thought, why don't we go back out and sample them again, the same way that we did a decade or so ago. We think there should be some decreases because of all of this kind of stuff that we have. So what we've done is we've gone out, we've resampled these prairies. We have done exactly the same sampling techniques that we used a decade ago. And then, God bless my little heart for putting things off, like removing the stakes from the hectare plots on these prairies that I sampled a decade ago and didn't quite get around to taking out. We were able to find all of our original plots again. So this past summer we went out and sampled again on these prairie preserves to make these comparisons that we can make. I don't have the data yet. We're still working. Kate's been working every day on identifying these bees. It takes a long time to put names to these things. What I can tell you is that we very quickly looked at the abundances. So we looked at our abundance distribution from the Monte Carlo and plopped down our samples from this summer. The good news is they look fine. Okay? Abundances are just as good as they were a decade ago in terms of the numbers of individuals we're catching. So that's good. We don't know what's going on with the actual diversity quite yet. All right. This is the resampling that we were doing. Here's what I think are my take-home messages that I would want you to walk out of here with. Better landscapes are better for the bees. Better landscapes are with more flowers, all right? And those kinds of places support a huge number of bees. The other thing that I am sort of surprised at is that high-quality small prairies are very valuable to the bees. Remember, we had just as good a bee diversity at those little railroad remnants, high-quality remnants, as we did as a big preserve. They are a magnet, those little places. They are drawing bees in from that landscape in a huge way. The other thing I think is that the landscapes are important. It's going to be important for our food sources because these small farms are depending on these wild bees to do their pollination. Okay? And so we need to be thinking about that when we think about our food sources and we think about food security. But the other thing is that all of this points to the fact that restorations are going to be really important. Restorations actually do work for bees, and the better your restoration, the better it will be for the bees, is what my prediction would be, to go out and sample restorations the same way that we've done, that they are going to work just like I think urban gardens work here in Iowa City, just like they work in California, where they know urban gardens in the San Francisco Bay Area are home to a huge community of wild bees. And so those are also going to be really important. Do those little restorations. They work. I have a huge bee diversity in my tiny little yard. So I would encourage you to do that. And then lastly, I don't do any of this stuff alone. In fact, some of it I don't even do at all. Okay? Like some of the pollen counting. These are all students that have worked in my lab. A huge number of students have come through the lab and worked so hard on doing the bee identifications. And there's a lot of colleagues that I work with on the almonds out of California. And I've gotten a lot of money from various places to do this, which is always good. And at that, I'll end, and I'll be glad to take any questions you got.